2014 on the motion that says up to privatize all sports associations in Malaysia. I invite the Prime Minister to start today's opening government. Here.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, no.
Wrong motion. Just a bit.
Side opening government believe that for far too long, the sporting culture in Malaysia has suffered greatly with the lack of effective governance and extreme politicization of individuals that are leading those particular sports associations. Mr. Speaker, what is the stance coming from side of opening government? A, we think that when you privatize sports association in Malaysia, it does two things. It assists in making it more effective in the way in which you govern that particular sporting association, and B, why the current governance isn't enough and why we need to start setting a standard, Mr. Speaker. But before I move on, what is the problem in this debate? Because you see multiple news stories over the years about how there are many misappropriation of the kind of funding that you have caught within the sporting associations. What's more popular will more likely get more funding as opposed to other things that are doing necessarily well but are not as popular, Mr. Speaker. We prosecute an example of how the Football Association of Malaysia get a lot more funding than things like diving, which is internationally more successful in comparison to the Football Club of Malaysia, right? Because we think that the problem stems from the fact that the individuals that are necessarily leading this association are individuals that were not appointed completely via merit, and we think that their kind of effective governance does not exist. But B, we also think that the sporting culture in Malaysia is so entrenched with the kind of politicization that is always attached to the corruption that exists within these particular scenarios, and we think that privatization is a way. What is a model for opening government? We'll outsource this to private companies that deal specifically with those particular sports. We think that this is a bid and win process that you can present your model in those states, right? But we don't think that we want any form of attachment to the government in terms of how we necessarily run this, because we don't think that it's enough. Firstly, why do we necessarily think it makes it more effective? The status quo inside of the government, we believe that the kind of leaders that you have leading this particular sporting association isn't capable enough. And we think that this is a failure of the government of Malaysia in terms of who they necessarily appoint, or thank you, in terms of leading this particular association, Mr. Speaker. Because we posit to you that it's not always about the kind of merit that you present, because you don't have to be a footballer who necessarily knows the ins and outs of football to be able to be appointed. But what's the matrix of consideration of appointing? We think it's things like golf buddy culture, or people that you necessarily know best, Mr. Speaker. You have members of the royal family or the crown prince of Pahang being appointed to run the Football Association of Malaysia just because sometimes he likes to play footy on the weekend, Mr. Speaker. Individuals like Shabuddin Chief, who is appointed on the fact that he was very close to the government in terms of how he necessarily presented himself. And we think that the way in which you operate or your decision making is always attached to the way the state perceives particular forms of sports, and we don't think that there's any interest for you to make it better. Why? Because of the kind of accountability that you have in the state. Obviously, our opposition will say, oh no, but society will get angry and we can fire this person anyway. But we think that when you firstly, we have to focus on the kind of focus that the country has in terms of prioritization of funding is broad and diverse, Mr. Speaker. And we think that in this particular scenario, the state can always deny the liability and say, we don't have to be accountable to the kind of problems that exist in sports association, because that's not the focus that we want to exist within our country, because we have other problems that are ongoing right now. But we think when you outsource it to a private company that specifically focus on the growth of that particular sporting association, we think that's good, because there's always every incentive, because companies always rely upon the fact that they want to make their brand look good because of the kind of confidence that they have in their investors, Mr. Speaker, appointing the best players, having the best kind of facilities, Mr. Speaker. And we think that this is very important as well. But why do we think that this incentive does not extend to the individuals that are currently running? But before I move on, sure.
Right, so you're okay with sports being a corporate structure and only exclusive to certain individuals because of the profit-driven incentive by the company?
We are okay with it being a corporate structure because we think that the kind of profit incentive that corporations have isn't so much about let's accumulate all the profit and keep it to ourselves, but because of the brand that companies have in terms of how do we maintain our international legitimacy as well as local legitimacy, we think that it's more likely than not that private companies have more of an incentive to want to funnel all of the profit that they might accrue to getting actual players and trying to raise the standard of sports within this country, Mr. Speaker. Hell, we need the football team to Malaysian people will come. And we think that's very important. But why do we think this incentive does not extend to sporting associations as of right now? Because we told in my preamble, no, thank you. The kind of priorities is always skewed to what is necessary for the speaker, not what is necessary doing best within a particular nation state. Because we think, right, the attachment of like particular leaders in society, politicians, the royal families, to particular forms of sports also means that the kind of funding that you get is always redirected to those individuals, as opposed to sports that are necessarily doing well but don't have enough funding. Things like women's volleyball, Mr. Speaker, don't get enough of an attention, even though they win the gold medal at the ASEAN Games. So thank you. But two, we also think that the kind of situation that you have is always marked by cronyism and the corruption that you have within this particular scenario. We think that there's no incentive whatsoever, because the kind of facility that they can always run the rhetoric that the facilities that we have is enough, that we will only try to do better when you do better, Mr. Speaker. And it's because a perpetual cycle of not being able to get out of that zone, right? But why necessarily sports? Well, thank you. Because we think that sports, like any other public good and public amenity, forms the identity of your country, right? And it makes up the building block of, especially in Malaysia, a multiracial country, that races can't agree on a lot of things, but we can agree on things like sports because it makes up the culture of the country, Mr. Speaker. And we think that in this particular scenario, the state has not taken incentive in trying to inculcate an environment that's better for individuals. Because more often than not, they want to focus on only particular races within a particular football team. For example, the Malaysian football team has a lot of Malays in there and they can't play for shit, right? And we don't know that this is good. We think that you have to start recognizing that when it's important and forms the identity of your country, that you have to make an active effort to make it a lot better. But why do we think that why do we think that we need privatization to start setting the standards, Mr. Speaker? In terms of trying to break into the international sphere, in terms of establishing yourself as a powerhouse within particular fields of sports, we think that the way in which you govern those particular sporting associations and the way in which you present yourself in terms of perception, the fact that sports becomes a value because the teams are good, not because it becomes attached to the corruption of that particular leader that was fired because society wants to know where did the money go to, Mr. Speaker. In this scenario, when we take an active effort to start privatizing these sporting associations, we think it makes it a lot better for you to start setting the standard to how do we achieve our goals within the international circuit and be able to break that wall, Mr. Speaker. If you believe that it's high time the Malaysian sporting scene starts to grow for real, you should go.
Yeah. And then the Prime Minister to get the case battle inside opposition, I invite the elbow. Here it is. Yeah.
I think the biggest flaw so far coming from the Prime Minister is that you always want to argue on an extreme case scenario of ineffective governance without actually talking about the debate why public governance in itself is worse off than privatization. Because what we're going to argue inside opposition is simple. We believe sports should belong to the people. We think that even when it comes to their efficiency, it should still be balanced out with people being able to feel included, with individuals being able to feel part of the particular sports that they love and feel passionate about. In my speech, basically, I'll talk about three major things. What exactly do sports associations do, and how do you actually cripple their ability to do this once they're privatized? Secondly, I'm going to talk about how exactly you improve the sports in itself with our interests as compared to privatization. And thirdly, I'm also going to talk about why exactly privatization is exclusively harmful towards athletes on the ground. But before I move on to that, a few rebuttals I don't think belong. Firstly, this idea of ineffective governance. We think that this entire argument is premised upon you electing the wrong minister of sports, or there being too much cronyism. We think legislation against that can still be approved. Sit down. For example, things like transparency laws. For example, things like making sure that these individuals are actually doing their jobs by having quality control, quality standards like KIBs, the government policies already have. Sit down. But what they have to prove is that how exactly, the moment you have to fight for a bid and a government tender from the state in order for you to get the sports association, will there be no corruption involved? Will there be no golf culture involved? Because people still have to be privy with the state and the ministers in order to get that private tender to begin with. I think corruption is ever worse on the Euro side because it lacks accountability. I'll talk about more of that in my questions later. Secondly was this idea of, because we want to create accountability upon these individuals, that's why we must have private corporations. Firstly, even if under our status quo, when states deny liability, at least the people can later vote the ministers out if they keep denying liability and don't continuously provide facilities. But you can do that over corporations. People don't have the say over who's part of that board of directors, who are in charge of that particular sports association. But we have a say of who belongs to that ministry and who dictates what sort of sports is important under our side. So accountability is better under our side, even if ministers keep denying it. The fact that they're continuously being written out is what's good under our paradigm. Sit down. It's already shown into analysis. The fact that right now our Ministry of Youth and Sports is someone young like Kari Jamaluddin, as opposed to some old guy like Shabari Chief who doesn't really play any sports to begin with, right? Lastly, this idea of social good. How basically we want to protect social good because corporations care about international reputation. Firstly, the way corporations care about international reputation is that how much money can I make when I enter that particular sporting market? That means it compromises all the other social goods that exist. For example, racial inclusivity, right? Ensuring that there is a form of social balance within the country where we include people from many different races. Corporations don't care about that. If you are an Indian and you don't make me money, I'm still not hiring you. And all these accusations that sports quality under our side is awful because of things like group push-up policy is wrong. We have people like S. Kunale or Safi, individuals who show merit when it comes to playing football and are good at it. So we think that there is a form of efficiency and social good being balanced out here. We're not expanding either or. Let's go to the first argument and what exactly the sport associations do and how you necessarily cripple this ability. They do three major things, right? Firstly, they regulate the little leagues that happen on the ground. Secondly, they give grassroots support. But what's important about grassroots support when it comes to public funding, sit down, is that this grassroots support is most of the time free. For example, they send people to schools and make free parks, free coaching trainings, things that corporations can't make that decision because there isn't a short-term profit incentive for them to do so. This is actually answered under the other side when they said, oh, but corporations need to look for actual talent. This obsession for actual talent removes any possibility of you catering to youth, of individuals who can improve, or people on the ground that you can support at the end of the day. So because these sports associations govern a lot of things, for example, national leagues and very small youth accessibility avenues, we think profit incentives actually compromises the ability for more and more people to access this particular avenue to begin with. But on a second level, you have to talk about how exactly you influence the sports culture on the ground. Because this is when I talk about more about things like youth development, right? From 1 year straight.
Considering the political landscape in Malaysia is so entrenched, the kind of corruption that we were talking about, how does your side of the house improve the quality that has not improved for decades?
Firstly, we go through that it has improved with all the isolated cases that have happened. But secondly, you also have to prove how exactly do you improve the matter when corporations take the things into their own hands as opposed to listening to the people who should have ownership of the sports to begin with. But secondly, it's about how exactly you improve the quality of these sports. Firstly, you increase risky ventures that cannot be taken by corporations. For example, entering into a village and finding a youth who has no talent at all and developing him, right? We think these things don't happen when profit becomes the incentive. Why? Because, for example, they put high entry fees for people to enter youth academies, so very few people have access to good training anyway. So they don't get access to these institutional facilities because they have to make profit from your ability to do this, right? Sit down. Secondly, there's also a lack of incentive for people to join these particular sports to begin with. Because what happens then when individuals feel that they have to compete with someone who's already heavily sponsored, but not also sponsored by your corporation, there's not an incentive for there to be equal competition or this ability for people to actually feel like I can actually compete with people like Drogba who's already heavily incentivized or all those things. That means you reduce youth participation with that particular sport and reduce the sustainability of that sport to remain within a particular paradigm, right? But finally, I'm going to talk about how exactly this is really compromised athletes, right? Firstly, we think that when we talk about a privatization of sports industry, the reason why it's all about harmful is because unlike privatization in other fields like engineering or industry, all those things, the trickle-down effect is existent because when people make money, they can now use it to fund other forms of fields of industries, right? But when you automatically fund just one sport like football, this doesn't trickle down to protecting cricket. This doesn't trickle down to protecting swimming, right? This trickle-down effect doesn't exist, and this cuts off a lot of people's ability to actualize themselves. Who? Athletes, right? Individuals now, because athletes have a very specialized skill. When they've already specialized their entire life in terms of weightlifting, but suddenly corporations stop funding it, they are not going to be able to go to other jobs. These people will lose their jobs because of the whole incentives that they've been put in, the investment they've been put in into that particular field of jobs to begin with. These people are people who need job security, and they can only be funded by state funds, or if states can actually show some of accountability, right? Because the reason why people actually own sports under our side is because right now, when people, we understand that the demand for sport continuously evolves, but now it evolves to the demands of the people who care about the national pride of that particular nation, the people who care about societal values as well, beyond corporations, right? So when people have a say over who elects their sports, who funds participation, that's when you make the sports belong to those particular individuals, right? That's when you make the demand for sports evolve throughout many different industries, as opposed to the corporations trying to intrude into the international market and make the most money, like saying that football is most profitable sport, let's do that instead. The conclusion of our case is simple. We want a balance. We understand efficiency exists. That's why I've told you about youth development. But we think that there is also a inclusiveness that needs to exist when it comes to sports as a social good, something they've yet to prove. That's why I'm proud to propose.
Yeah.
I take the opposition to end the case like opening government. I find that everybody is here.
Here. Adjusting the word. Within Zing's case was highly general, it only talking about public, the difference between public ownership as well as private ownership. We don't specify the context in Malaysia because this is evident through him ignoring very, very important points and very context-sensitive points that Jay pointed out. Because Jay told you three very important things that didn't get sufficient response to. One, the existing problem in Malaysia, things like prioritization of funding, things like how certain sports and the funds of sports are not directed by needs, but by popularity. This is an existing problem in Malaysia and continues to exist. The only solution he has to problems like cronyism and corruption and all the problems that it entails Malaysian politics to begin with is that we should probably introduce more transparency laws and more laws like that. There has been many amendments and many tries to introduce a lot of transparency laws, and all the transparency laws still have to go through a large amount of bureaucracy. So right now, all those things are not working, and Malaysian government aren't functioning in a way that would justify us giving them this amount of power to look after our sports industry. So we think all the harms that Jay brought to you, like prioritization of funding, about how some sports will be left behind, about how cronyism happened, about how it's ineffective, are things that they fail to deal with. So let's deal with a few concerns that they have in this debate. Right? Firstly, they say that the sporting associations that are privatized are less accountable to the people. Firstly, we must argue in context first that Malaysian government, the sporting association of Malaysian government are very accountable to the people as well. There are many avenues for the people to go through to make sure that the government is accountable for the things they do because of the huge lack of transparency that they have. But secondly, why are private companies also accountable? Like for example, the sporting associations in Europe are accountable to their fans and people who heavily support that particular sport. So a lot of people on the ground take a valid interest in sports and hold sporting associations accountable. And we think it's a trend of sporting associations to be very appealing to people because they heavily rely on their fans when it comes to things like funding and things like that. So we think they'll always be accountable to the people, always be accountable to the players, and they're also open to normal existing laws. Like you can sue them in cases where they do things that are wrong and all those things. And we think their corporate structure, they're a lot more accountable to the people, and justice is a lot more accessible. But we think that's also a problem in Zim's case, in which we generalize what a sports association is and the entire Ministry of Sports as well as the government itself. Because we say things like sport development and establishing facility as well as like youth development of sports in school levels or university levels are things that governments still do anyway and are devoid of sports associations. Sports associations are specific associations that deal with particular particular sports. Like for example, the Football Association and things like that. The Ministry of Sport can still do other things like grassroots level development, still do things like developing facilities like swimming pool and tracks. The government can't suddenly stop all those things just because associations are privatized. We think it's extremely stupid for any government to ever do that. No, thank you. Like for example, even though transportation is privatized in certain countries, they still build roads. Those things are not mutually exclusive. So we think all the problems that he brought forward, things like there will be less grassroots development and all those things don't exist because people on the ground, as long as people on the ground demand grassroots development at school levels, the government will be obligated to provide for them. So we don't think that changes anything. No, thank you. So he also, his third concern is that social good can exist in both situations. He said that the government could be able to include non-Malays within the sporting associations as well as different people. But we need to examine the attitude in which Malaysian government treat these different individuals and how they react to them. So the attitude of Malaysian government, as we see, they mainly prioritize one peninsular people as well as Malay people as well. Sports that are heavily dominated by Malay are the ones that receive the most amount of funding, except for some isolated cases. So sporting events that are dominated by Sarawakians are also sporting events that get very little funding, for example, diving and things like that. So we think that there's an attitude in which Malaysian government treat certain players and certain people and stakeholders within the government. So we think now social good is more likely to happen under privatization. Because if you have the Sporting Association of Diving in Sarawak that specifically caters to the people of Sarawak, they have every incentive to develop the players over there because their entire reputation as well as their profit relies on the ability of those people to perform. And we don't think they will create an entrance barrier because the less people, the more people they limit into their sporting association, the less ability for them to perform and things like that. So we don't think they'll have any incentive to limit things like that. No, thank you, right? So furthermore, we also think that ownership by people can still happen. People can always be involved in sport regardless of whether it's privatized or whether it's government associated, because there will always be people, access to people on the ground, and there will always be demand for people to be involved in sports as well. So as long as sport is still a people sport and sports are always accountable to the people, we think it's likely that people can still gain ownership. And it still belongs to the people, in a second, sir. It belongs to the people as long as they perform well and the sports do well. We think that more people have more support towards the sport, and that's inherently better.
How is it fair for smaller sports to rely on meager government funding to compete against big sports that have corporate investments on the
We think both sports inherit. This is the idea, right? In Malaysia, there's already a disproportionate amount of funding to different sports. But it's more likely that we'll get more funding for the smaller sports because private companies have more incentive to gain more funding as opposed to the government who do not get incentive to gain funding for the smaller sports. And sports that private companies can see profit into. Like for example, ping-pong or sports like that private companies can see incentive in establishing. We think that private companies can then do those sports justice. But inherently, this debate is very simple. This debate is just about whether or not the current government of Malaysia are treating sports right or are fully functioning in the way they treat sports and are effective. And we don't think they are. There are multiple problems that we already pointed out. And it's also about the ability of private companies to fully enhance the ability of the sporting arena in Malaysia. Because we think it's a very good arena and a lot of talented people in Malaysia. And we think that it's high time we allow companies that can be accountable to the people, have an incentive to be accountable to their sporting players, and has an incentive to develop a wholesome development of their players and better management. They are free of corruption and free of non-effective governance and things like that. If you agree that the Malaysian government is one doing a bad job, it is. That private company has higher ability and has shown in many cases to be able to do all these things, you have to propose.
And then the Prime Minister to end the debate in the opening houses and the case decided to position and by THW. Here.
We want to talk about the government of Malaysia, but the government of Malaysia will only act in a corrupted manner when they are in charge of the sports association. In contrast, when they want to select the tender of who should be in charge. And therefore, we don't think only on that statement alone, they can suddenly run and you will have this clean form of selecting of a company, and this company will be so nice up to a point they will abide by all obligation and ensure that the sport will run perfectly. That statement alone already shows like how funny their case is. But the second statement is how can a sports association actually make a profit out of it? Like you need to look at the structure of sports and understand. If you watch John Oliver's video on how FIFA makes money, you would clearly understand how sports association make money in the first place. Number one, they will ensure they will entrench their own group in order for them to get a lot of money away from the players in order for them to benefit only by themselves. Number two, they will also ensure that little amount of money actually goes down to the people who actually develop the sports in the first place, because these owners are the ones who want to keep all the profit at the end of the day. And this is why we believe it's extremely wrong for you now to have a body which is less accountable, which can run away with the idea that it's not wrong for me to spend less money in contrast to status quo, because that's how corporates work. It's on profit-driven incentive. They can say that we don't want to spend money, we want to spend money, there is nothing that you can do. The same way as how Manchester United fans were crying for Malcolm Gleeson to give them money, but they didn't get the money at the end of the day. This is how profit-oriented sports association will behave in their paradigm. But then they come here and tell us another one thing. This is the third premise and why they are extremely wrong. About the prioritization of funding. The prioritization of funding under status quo happens based on demand of the people. The only reason why football gets more funding than any other sport is because of the demand of the people, in contrast to the success rate and so on. Because what happens in their paradigm? How many sports in Malaysia could actually get profit? How many sports in Malaysia could actually be successful at the end of the day? Cricket wouldn't get any funding. No corporation would ever want to invest in that particular sport. That sports will eventually die out. Prioritization of funding in their paradigm will be extremely worse, where certain sports have no interest at all by corporation, because yes, you can set up tenders, but if I don't think I can get money from it, why would I even want to enter a particular venture in the first place? So how do you get balance it out? All of these things are in Zim's page and was not responded at all. First issue. How do you actually ensure grassroots development, and how do we actually enhance it in our paradigm? They come here with a chicken case by telling us that grassroots development can happen when government still invest in terms of providing field and parks and so on. But the difference is this: when government provided under our paradigm, they work hand in hand with the sports association, which is directly under their control. They can regulate and tell these coaches to come down and coach for free. They can tell these coaches to open up sports for more, like this sports for more people to come and join the training session and so on. But let's juxtapose it to their paradigm. What will happen in terms of grassroots development in their paradigm? Guys, like, sit down, chill first. I'll accept one minute. Like you guys are like, very okay. What will happen in their paradigm? Like the sports association now will have a direct say by saying that why would I want to go to that school? That school doesn't attract my attention at all. I don't think there's any talent at all coming from that school and so on. Like I don't have to waste my money, send my coaches there. All of this justification can only exist in their paradigm when the sports association are not actually accountable to the people. Because for them, as long as fans coming to the stadium, as long as players keep on winning for them, they are more than happy. They don't need to cater towards every single citizen that belong in that particular country, in contrast to a sports association actually being under the government. For the next level, we need to argue about the attitudes of athletes in the first place. I'm going to develop even further what Zim have talked about and why this is actually important when it comes to athletes and why they need to engage and why there's a big downfall on their paradigm. You need to understand that when you become a sports athlete, it's your right to self-actualize in that manner. It's important for you to understand that government must provide you with certain amount of avenue regardless of what sports you are playing. For example, if you think that under their paradigm, would the sports of Dota get any form of funding in terms of team orange or such on? We don't think that can happen at all under their paradigm because it's so hard. First, you must find a corporation that is willing to fund you in the first place, which means the procedure will be far longer. You have to wait for a planning process and so on. But in contrast to our paradigm, where the distribution of money will be far more equal. You just need to show success, therefore the money will go into your particular paradigm, and that particular funding will develop the sports even further. That can only happen in our paradigm. When the minister actually realized there's a lot of people actually playing this sports, and I see a huge potential in it, even though I don't see any profit coming out of it. I even allow owners to keep all their winning money. So in contrast to their paradigm, like what happens if a sports association actually own? I want half of your winning money because I want to create some form of profit at the end. I'll take one for closing.
The fact that these people are becoming insular towards sports is because the association of the sports association towards the idea of state being corrupted. How did your proposal dive was in that idea?
Like this is where I find it extremely problematic. Like you find the sports association corrupted, your solution is to run away from solving that problem and say that let's try a different organization and hopefully they can fulfill all of our burden and need. Then how does that really solve the problem that the sports athlete really need? But what will happen in our paradigm? We are actually accountable to the people and you can actually vote them out. This is what exactly happened when Najib realized that Shabir Chip is a useless party minister in that particular context. Oh shit, it's recorded. But don't worry, you're a better minister in like other departments, but let's talk about KJ for a moment. KJ understands that sports need to be more close to the people and so on. That's why he invests a lot of money, not only in terms of developing the sports from an association perspective, but he also spends a lot of money in terms of fit for Malaysia and tell people to actually be involved in sport. One student was a directive from the government themselves. This can only work hand in hand when they are controlling the sports association and they can dictate the rule of what a sports association can do. But in contrast to their paradigm, one sport for Malaysia can exist in regards of whatever paradigm. But since sports association might not accept the players, might not provide the avenue for them to train, might not provide the coaches and so on, all of these facilities and so on, will then any form of development program by the government work? We don't think so. That paradigm is a paradigm where the interest of the government will conflict with the private corporation who only want profit. Under this particular paradigm, we don't think that everyone can get benefit, but only a few specialized people. I beg to propose.
Yeah.
I think there is a solution. Everything might come
Still can be divided.
In closing, government will think that the idea of sport should be about association of individuals towards sport being a public commodities. And outside the house, we'll further expound those ideas and they'll bring back into my station. Before I move on further, allow me to rebut this opening opposition. Number one, they talked about the idea of mismanagement stems from the election of wrong ministers. I have two responses to that. Number one, that your mechanism of voting out these ministers, ladies and gentlemen, via election only comes in 4 to 5 years, right? Because under your side of the house, you cannot remove these ministers, ladies and gentlemen, that has been committing this corruption. But secondly, this is at the very best a false paradigm to begin with, because these leaders, ladies and gentlemen, of the sports association cannot be voted out via election, guys, because these leaders are there because they have the highest shares and because they have the most capital income, ladies and gentlemen, and they have the highest shares. And they have the highest shares. Under your side of the house, under your side of the house, these individuals and these corrupted leaders, ladies and gentlemen, will forever administer our sport. And there's no mechanism between these 4 to 5 years, ladies and gentlemen, and we tell you that's very detrimental. We're not trying to run away from the real problem that is existing in status quo. But as of right now, looking at the fact that people are becoming insular towards the idea of sport, what should we do? That, ladies and gentlemen, should we remove the idea of association of sports of being a corruptive state, or should we then go to on another level and have corporations to privatize our sports association, ladies and gentlemen? Sit down. Secondly, they also talk about the idea of these private corporations won't go to other villages, ladies and gentlemen, like sports association does. Number one, we tell you that this corporation will also venture into this, even though there is highly risky, ladies and gentlemen, because there is a need for them to manage the pool of the talent, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we don't think there's any difference between your side and our side in terms of management of the pool of talent, ladies and gentlemen. Because on the outside of the house, this corporation will always have the incentive to get the better player, ladies and gentlemen, that they can get. They will go from Kuala Lumpur and also the villages of Podiang in Kedah, ladies and gentlemen, in order for them to have the best player anyway. Therefore, we think that this idea is not mutually exclusive on the side of opposition. Sit down. This is very apparent also evident in current state in status quo, ladies and gentlemen, where TMJ under Johor has take Safi Sali and also Eskunala, ladies and gentlemen, that were kampung boys back then, ladies and gentlemen. And this is something that we think is a benefit. It's something which is a benefit that we can accrue from when we privatize this sports association. Sit down. They also talk about the idea of the accountability of the sports association. We tell you that these people, ladies and gentlemen, the idea of accountability is something which is not mutually exclusive either. Because under both sides of the house, ladies and gentlemen, this association need to also be accountable towards their people and also towards their fans, ladies and gentlemen. They need to pander on their fans anyway, because their fans are the ones who support them, ladies and gentlemen. Because under your side of the house, you cannot claim just because these people privatize their sports association, then just because these people privatize their sports association, then you will have a better accountability. Because we think the idea of accountability also exists under outside the house, because there will be check and balances and also scrutiny by the fans and also the people at large. Before I move on to my extension, yeah, sure.
Yeah, both corporations and states can fail. My question to you is, how often do you have elections to receive both corporations?
Because it's fan-based and also performance-based. So whenever these people, ladies and gentlemen, have made some has been accused of corruption, they'll obviously be voted out by the fans, ladies and gentlemen. That's what happened. Like what happened in the football in Johor, ladies and gentlemen. It's very apparent, guys. The context is in Malaysia anyway. Sit down. In OG, they talked about that when privatized, we will assist the ability to govern sports. Then there's a need for politicization of sport and mismanagement of fund. In closing government, ladies and gentlemen, we will tell you that privatization of sports association will create a more inclusive idea of sports, and it is the public commodities, and everyone will enjoy the sports given naturally, ladies and gentlemen. We think that there is a huge differences between national interest-related sport versus private corporation related association, ladies and gentlemen. And this interest is where something which is beneficial, that is non-existent on the side of opposition. Sit down. We think that people do consider sport seriously, and the existence of the ultras is an evidence of how sports is the second religion of a man, ladies and gentlemen. This is why I engage in opening opposition idea on how we compromise athletes. To tell you no, that we, on the outside, will never compromise athletes, ladies and gentlemen, as we incentivize these players to perform better. How? Firstly, let's look at the current existing athletes, ladies and gentlemen, that these people are entrenched by state protectionist policy, ladies and gentlemen. I.e., you cannot go away and you cannot be transferred to higher league even when you are the best players that's existing, ladies and gentlemen. And this promotes complacency, number one, and number two, leads to stagnation of sport, ladies and gentlemen, because these individuals or these athletes will forever have this mindset that I will not get that particular fund, or I will not get a higher pay, ladies and gentlemen, even if I'm the best possible player at the current point of time. Sit down. But secondly, how do we best handle the idea of young and so grassroots developmental athletes, ladies and gentlemen? On the outside of the house, we encourage more athletes, we encourage these athletes, ladies and gentlemen, from village to come out and also participate, knowing that they can get more paid and higher salary, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, corporations will also have to open up this pool of athletes, ladies and gentlemen, knowing the fact that there will be a flood of people that comes to try out. But secondly, our proposal, ladies and gentlemen, also empowers the inclusiveness of sport. Our house disassociate the sports from the government, ladies and gentlemen, which is basically what people in Malaysia want. Because society as of right now, ladies and gentlemen, are angry at the government because of the entrenchment of government anyway, and also how sports is being heavily politicized. On the outside, ladies and gentlemen, we allow sports to be divorced from the idea of states, corruption, ladies and gentlemen, and also states association. This is how you allow better discourse in terms of what strategy that you need to use in order for you to propagate that particular sport, ladies and gentlemen. Believe me, if there is a side that is willing to fight for the empowerment of sport and what's best for the sports in Malaysia, it's side closing government.
member of government to start the game side of the opposition, I can be member of opposition.
I'm not going for your time.
I don't know what it is. Paper.
What just happened? It was right. Sorry, Grandma.
Usually the warrior is the audio in market.
Yeah.
Great. Then to the
Government thinks rich private owners to be the bastions of the sports for Malaysia, right? When you have individuals that are billionaires that are necessarily coming from Malaysia, like Tony Fernandez and Vincent Tan, opting to go for international brands because that would be the more lucrative form of opportunities, we think there are no incentives for them to want to develop homegrown talent. We don't think there are any incentives for them to want to develop the sports in Malaysia because we think that revenue and profit for these individuals will be the utmost important value. 1, 2, right? They say that suddenly now all of these benefits that we're talking about that are supposed to be exclusive to our paradigm can also exist under that paradigm. Number 1, that's not true. But on the flip side, all of the benefits they're talking about can exist through sponsorship of private companies. But we don't think ownership per se is something necessary for institutions in Malaysia because the Squash Association a few years ago was about to die out. But because of the nationalistic ideal of actually wanting to develop squash because of homegrown talent, the government actually gave that minimum funding, as minimal as it was, to develop homegrown talent, and that's why they actually were able to develop. We don't think that incentive exists under private corporations. In my speech, you'll hear 3 things. Number 1, I'll tell you why the nationalist agenda is necessarily important to also protect unpopular sports that would unnecessarily die out under their agenda. Number 2, I'll tell you how there's a need incentive for now government to develop local players as opposed to international players that are necessarily more talented, as according to your characterization. Number 3, I'll tell you why decision-making in sports associations will be affected, and I'll tell you why that's particularly harmful. Before that, let's engage with what the idea that you brought up, right? Essentially the same thing OJ talked about. The entrenchment of corporate corruption, the entrenchment of all forms of badness in government, right? Because the government is only made of the sultans that agree. Look, we agree that the sultans are not necessarily the best people. We think on a larger scale, right? On a larger scale, right? The individuals that are private, individuals from private companies will not be better off. And in fact, they will be worse off because number 1, like we told you along the bench, there's no accountability. But number 2, we think it's particularly harmful when we automatically assume that all of the sultans or all of the Malaysian people, all the government people will necessarily be bad, but all of the private corporations will necessarily be good. You're not engaging on a moderate level with our paradigm either, right? That's why you guys will lose out. But never mind that. You proved that you wanted the worst of corruption. But the same kinds of corruption could also exist under your paradigm, and nothing would be better off. If you can't fire a private owner because that person freaking owns the freaking association, right? You can't just say, oh, he's bad. We can say he should be fired. Look, as long as he knows he has an avenue to make money, he will fully utilize that avenue, and he won't want to actually eliminate himself from the equation. Well, one of my first extensions straight away, right? Why is nationalist agenda more important in terms of you trying to promote unpopular sports? Because when you're talking about the sports association itself, you're also talking about how sports association also help build up schools for sports as well, right? We think particularly when you have private companies not wanting to cater to the demands or cater to the needs of homegrown talent because they think there are more international players from, I don't know, Senegal or freaking UK or freaking Singapore that are better off than Malaysians, they will never have the incentive or inherent incentive to actually want to benefit the people from rural areas or from the villages you don't try to talk about, right? You want the most inclusive form of framework. And we think that this nationalist agenda allows for different forms of sports to also still be able to live out. Because we think that exclusive idea of accountability that's coming from opposition is that when governments do feel that society still wants to hold, traditional forms of sports, like sepak takraw, right? Or like assuming the guys international, the private owners international, they will never have an inherent higher incentive to develop because there's no brand to it or there's no lucrativity for it. And we think that's particularly helpful if you really want to benefit the kinds of sports we're talking about in Malaysia. But what else is also important, right? Because there's no effort for them to want to reach out to the people as well to promote the sports. Whereas like governments would want to do that, even if it starts off small, they would actually want to tell individuals on the ground that it can be a sport that could be popular in the long run, as opposed to their side, right? But on second level, right, we think there's an incentive also to cultivate local talent, because at which point when you go, for international players that are necessarily more lucrative for your club, right? It is particularly helpful because then this becomes a platform for commercial and revenue alone. Your side does cater to the fans, but a different approach by catering to the revenue. Our side actually caters to the sport and the fans as well. I think that's particularly better when you're talking about the private level, because sports for a lot of people, like you said, right, are not just an avenue for expression. It's basically the escape, or it means a lot to them. It's a second religion to them, and that's what you need that kind of value. By only commercializing it or making it something cosmetic, we think that's particularly harmful, and it turns people off to the idea. Before I move on, Odie.
Look, Amtra said in his speech that prioritization of funding is always based on the demand. So how does your nationalistic agenda protect every single sport exists, especially when engineering still exists, when fans can become shareholders?
Because when you had homegrown talent like Nicole David, even though she wasn't fully established back then, claiming to be part of, claiming to want to have a movement to actually pursue squash, the government actually wasn't able to listen to them, as opposed to your paradigm. Because your paradigm, like we've established, it doesn't actually cater to the potential people. Your side only caters to the established kind of credential of people. Sit down. But let's move on to this idea of how decision making in sports associations would be effective, right? Because you want to talk about how you cater to the fans, but even then we contest, because at which point private owners have full autonomy over the sports association. We think that form of not just lack of accountability, but that autonomy is necessarily detrimental. It's never what the people want, especially when you're talking about big clubs that are supposed to cater to how the fans respond to them as well. We're talking about how you may have talismans or like individuals that you necessarily are historically affectionate for, right? Those individuals will never be valued by private companies, because at which point they're seen as old or stale. The government, the private companies that don't have an incentive to value them even more. What does this do, right? If it's not what the fans want, like for example in the UK, right, when Frank Lampard was let go, even though the fans actually wanted him to stay, you disenfranchise the fans, because at which point you don't actually allow the fans to also see the club that they love and grew up with become what they want it to be. That's when it was particularly harmful for them to respond to the sports as well. That's when you have also individuals on the ground not having an incentive to want to be in that club if they're not some a young Belgian or a young Brazilian, right? We think when you argue that you want to fight for the fans and you want to fight for the overall development of the sports, then you should understand that our pattern actually offers more of the tangible benefits as opposed to the arbitrary, non-mutually exclusive benefits the government can propose. Always have you.
I don't know which is the case side, both the government and the government as a whole, and then the government. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, football is a religion in Brazil, and apparently it's the same for us, even though Islam is a religion of federation. But here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen, it's so upsetting, it's very upsetful that our religion of football, and other sports like squash or badminton, like the next groundbreaking player is not existential, ladies and gentlemen, and this is due to the bad decision making by government today, right? We think privatizing sports association has many benefits, as pointed out by the government bench, especially when it comes to closing government, right? Let's look at a few issues that arose inside the PHP, right? Let's deal with opening opposition. First thing, they argue that, well, if you privatize association, well, there will be social imbalance created inside the association, inside corporations, right? They argue that FAM, like what FAM allows Khana and other Indian players to play just for the sake of social inequality that exists in status quo. Incorrect. Why? First reason, we think the reason why FAM hire those kind of players are threefold. First, because they're good players, because they can play football, that's why we hire them. Secondly, because they are committed footballers, and thus you deserve to be a responsibility. But thirdly, we think when you are able to contribute consistently, that's when you hire these footballers. The best case scenario here is this: assuming that we hire them because of the social inequality, we think it's the same thing for corporations. Why do we think so? Because corporations, same as what FAM right now, is under public scrutiny. Right? But the difference, the public scrutiny that is happening inside closing government is this: that now is incentivize them to diversify the players that they have, similar to that what is having inside a side of opening opposition wants, right? But the better part of it, right, in fact, if that player is very good, right, then we hire him or her. We think it's mutually exclusive. Like if that player is good, both sides, we think we will hire them, but we don't hire them because of social inequality, right? But here's the thing: let's look at the second issue. Let's look at the second issue here. Well, on the idea that it will ossify the youth development and less inclusion by youth. Well, we have a few problems with that argument. Like, their idea is that corporations won't go to jungles or hamlets or even swamps to find new best players inside particular fields. What we argue differently. We think it's wrong. We think it's wrong to think that. We think it incentivizes corporations better to go to those areas. Like, why? Because we have to understand the logic of corporations. Like, corporations are very profit-driven, and the only way for them to gain profit is for you to find the best way to sell your company and to advance your company in the next stage. And how do you do that? Like, you hire new people to be good. For example, if your image right now is not as good as it is supposed to be, then you hire good employees, you hire better employees with high qualification or with new talents. Those kind of incentives will also exist inside our paradigm. But more it's more because corporation has that more incentive to gain more profit and to gain a better image inside the sphere of sport. And what we argue here is that their idea that will ossify youth development and inclusion will never happen. Because we think what companies do is as similar as what associations do right now, but the only difference is that we do it even more because we're concerned of the profit that we gain. Everything is not enough, then we go deeper in the jungle or maybe go in the cities and find more good players in the first place. Now, let's look at the idea of accountability. I think this is very important. Right? Like our idea of accountability is very simple, ladies and gentlemen. So what happens about accountability? What happens if corporations can never face accountability? That's what they argue. We tell you it's very good on our side. What will happen if things go bad if corporations don't manage those sports associations as it's supposed to be? Few things. Firstly, we think that corporation will lose public interest in general. That means less support and tarnishes the image of that corporation who manage that sport association. Meaning that they lose more support and they can't drive forward their company and say we have the best team in Malaysia. We don't think that will happen, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a bad image. Secondly, we think when media portrays bad management of that corporation, then the result is this. Now they have no choice. It's either do it or die, ladies and gentlemen. If they don't proceed on and try to improve their company, ladies and gentlemen, sooner or later that company will die out, and we think that is the thing that corporations will not take the risk to do. Now, thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, the idea of how do you fire a CEO if he done things badly. Well, we have board of directors that can decide for the next CEO. We don't think CEO of a corporation is arbitrary in nature in any corporation. We have board of directors that ensure that the CEO is not managing the company as it's supposed to be, in a profitable way, ladies and gentlemen, then that is the moment when board of directors take action against that CEO and ensure that you replace him with someone that is someone that can drive the company forward. Right? Before I move on, go.
In a lot of occasions, corporations can still make a profit even if they don't listen to the fan base. How then do you ensure the sport does cater to the demands of people who are passionate about it, as opposed to this empty, profit-hungry entity that
the reason why they are profitable, ladies and gentlemen, because of that sport is successful. When that sport is successful under your management, meaning you get more sponsorship, meaning you get more viewers, meaning you get more sale on tickets. That means, like indirectly, that means that society who are affiliated with that sport, ladies and gentlemen, will like that sport, ladies and gentlemen. And that very much. The accountability on our side is very simple. Right? What happened? The accountability that happens inside the school is this. Well, because they are public figures, we can't just scar their images, right? We think those people who are taking up their administrations are people like sultans or people like politicians. If we talk bad things about them, it'll be seditious, right? Then we have state protection policy that protect these officials from being criticized. And if you criticize them, well, we send you to jail or whatnot. Let's look at idea coming from closing our position here. On the nationalist idea, right? Well, we say this, like state priority exists inside the school, right? But sports will get less, sports like Chakra that they try to mention, will get lesser fun compared to football. And that's their evidential proof, right? Like the idea of nationalistic that they try to portray can never be achieved. Why? Because number one, there's a lack of funding. But two, a different prioritization inside the school. Now, government don't prioritize Chakra is because it's less popular compared to football. That idea will never achieve at the very end of the day. Our side believes in corporations. Why? It's profit driven. It can give better facilities and better teams.
Here.
And then the government will as the case was like the solution to be as a whole, I find the opposition with here.
I'd first like to establish and break the step up in the idea of corrupted leaders, because both sides seem to assume that corrupted leaders will happen in either paradigms. Number one, in the balance of harm, assuming that there are still corrupted leaders within a private company, the characterization of them is that they're too big to fail. Why? Because profit will always be the end result. When it's maximization of profit, profit is like the biggest rational calculus in every decision-making process. What does this mean? That means the point at which they have been corrupted, they would rather escape liability and garner more profit than be held accountable like the people on the ground. That's the kind of characterization that we want to avoid. For example, when we have oil companies investing in countries like Africa, and the point at which they have to be brought to court and have to be accountable, they pull out immediately. These are the kind of things that we do not want to happen, especially under their policy. What happens under public companies? The point is that the rational calculus that these people have to take into account is elections or public perception, because these individuals do belong to the public at the end of the day. The interest of the public is of paramount importance and not the profit-based industry. That's why it's so crucial, and that's why the idea of corruption is less in our paradigm. But moving on, let's move on to the two issues. Who, both sides, make sports more inclusive, but secondly, who better cultivates better athletes and make sure that athletes are being accommodated for. But before we move on, yes, either way.
Look, clubs that are European leagues that are privatized also employ inclusionary policies by allowing fans to buy shares and be part of the board of directors that shows corporations have incentives to include fans. What is the contention to accountability there?
Because the point at which you have to make a decision, profit will be the end result. Profit is the end result. That's why it's a private company. That's what you guys have to defend. You cannot want everything and profit be just shot out of the window. Why? Because you have creditors, you have investors, you have sponsors, and all these people you have to cater for. And at the end of the day, the people who even own the shares are very minimal. They're not majority shareholders. Well, the point at which the public or fans are majority shareholders, that's the public company. But I don't know, company law 101, deal with that. So number one, who makes sports more inclusive? Let's see the comparison. Like the nature, like I've already established that the nature of private-owned companies is extremely exclusive. The fact is like they only see the sport as being relevant the moment that people around it see as being relevant. The point at which we've already established that Chakra has lost popularity within the region, a nationalist sport in which we have created
companies are not going to invest in it. That's why that's why the government intervention is so crucial to retain nationalist identity. That's how we have to maintain some sort of culture, because these are the sort of abstract and ideological things that only a government can take into account, not a private corporation. Sit down. So so that's one thing. But the second thing that we think the government agendas have to take into account is that they're very objective and very holistic of the society as a whole. What do I mean by this? It means that you have the idea is a Ministry of Health and Sports as well. That means you can government incorporates health policies and also into like an active lifestyle. I mean, how else do you think that a ministry can only promote a healthy lifestyle independently without incorporating into like an active lifestyle with PG's contribution as well? We think that these kind of agendas are holistic and intertwined. Like these policies can only be pushed fully when you have bodies that take into the relevancy of it at the end of the day. Please sit down. So how then do you include more athletes into the bigger picture? We've established to you the point at which that sport does not become popular. That means that the corporations are going to pull out and they're not going to fund that very thing. What does this mean? That means companies will control sports schools. Companies will control the kind of sports that are established. They mean it'll be extremely elitist. The point at which, like back then, when we thought tennis was only for the rich, we thought horseback riding was only for the rich. The point at which the government funds or allows any sort of allocation of funds into these extremely expensive sports and allows people within rural areas to be included within, not only cultivates or finds garners more talent in which the government can afford to do so because they don't think about profit or like the short-end profit at the end of the day, but also it allows accessibility or the kind of luxury and actualization that the people within the rural areas could have never had attached themselves to. What does this mean? And the comparison within like private companies in that is that they'll never really think about going to rural areas to find new talent. Why? I'll tell you why. Because number one, it's too costly to have like 1 month or 2 months expenditure to find new talent, cultivate that within the next 5 years, and try and take that gamble on whether or not he will actually be recruited. Why? Because they're extremely dependent on the lucrative profit-based industry of a quarterly income. That means a profit-based, like the idea of investors has to see the data now. The point at which you create profit now, the point at which is that you see people winning. That's the idea of sponsorship. You cannot risk spending 3 months or 5 years trying to find new talent and cultivate it. It's just not lucrative. The decision-making process then becomes like the conflict between your local talent and finding international or other people outside to bring in. Then you're more willing to choose people from outside. That's the harm there. What does this mean? If you look at the comparative, like Singapore, the point at which they actually kept on importing new athletes from China made the Singaporeans lose complete interest in sports. That's why the ratings went down, the sponsors went down. The government had to invest in them. If you look at Li Jiawei, with the Chinese, they don't even speak English, who was taken in by Singapore itself, and like made the people just lose interest in it as a whole. What does this mean? That means what was once a unifying agenda, an umbrella between people of all nations, of all races, like watching the sports, or even like bigoted Malays who are watching Lee Chong Wei can actually support him. This is the unifying factor that we have to protect. What have I told you about today? Number one, the like publicization of sports in terms of the government agenda is extremely crucial because it not only thinks about the people holistically, but also has to consider the local talent we have to cultivate within 10 years' time. But number two, like the point at which the government is actually in play in determining the kind of sports, we also save dying sports. What do you mean by that? Like in Johor, when the Tunku actually invested 2 million ringgit in sports, is because we just kept losing year by year. But the point at which she kept on pumping in money, cultivating players, improving the facilities, that's the intervention that we needed at that point in time. We just cannot let dying sports die out and let the minority sports like not have any investors at all. That's what we're protecting. Thank you.
Okay, and then after the week, we just make on the floor and shake hands and yeah, we'll be back.
Yes.